All right, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast, BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. We have another different kind of upload today. We're going to be talking about the case of an individual named Wallace Fard, also known as Wallace Fard Muhammad, who is most famously known, I'd say, for being credited as the founder of the religious movement in America, the Nation of Islam, of course, differentiating from just Islam itself. But what I would sort of say by introducing this particular subject is, as a true crime fan, sometimes we follow the FBI top 10 most wanted list. And back in 2014, I was kind of just checking up on that stuff a lot. And you learn that they have a lot of material that is just available online that you can read about a variety of cases. It's not only the top 10 most wanted list, they also have their terrorists and cyber criminals. And then they just have info that is available on a variety of individuals. And one of them that stood out to me was Wallace Fard, otherwise known as Wallace Fard Muhammad. And this is something where I just began trying to take in more and more information about this particular individual because I had come across the name when I was learning about the beginnings of the Nation of Islam, the 20th century. It's kind of a quasi pseudo religious movement. It's sort of combining elements of Christianity and Islam together, partnered with black supremacy, Afrocentrism, some of those things. But I always remembered one particular line that was actually on Wikipedia, and I believe it's no longer up there. I believe they revamped the Wikipedia from the Nation of Islam, and they said that people who practice and follow the Nation of Islam believed that the universe was created by Wallace Fard Muhammad, the person we're going to be talking about today. And that's something that's always stood out to me. I was like, what in the world? They think that everything was created by Wallace Fard Muhammad? I mean, some guy who was born in the 20th century? Like, what's going on there? So then I began to learn a little more about him, like, because once I found, like, the FBI stuff on Wallace Fard. And okay, it's not so much that I guess practitioners of the Nation of Islam believe that Wallace Fard Muhammad created everything. According to the legend, this guy Wallace Fard was saying that he was the reincarnation of Allah, or he was the reincarnation of God. He was the human embodiment of God. He was God that came back on earth, something of that nature. And that his kind of prophet and major disciple became a man named Elijah Poole, who then changed his name to Elijah Muhammad. Now, the reason why this is titled The Mystery of Wallace Fard Muhammad is he's a person who is a very unusual individual. And it's like no one really knows his origin, no one knows what happened to him, no one knows where he ended up, but he is credited as being the founder of the Nation of Islam. Although, if I recall, he was only involved with the Nation of Islam for a very short period of time, and for a while it was even referred to as the Temple of Allah. Now, we aren't going to talk too much about spirituality and the theological aspects of the Nation of Islam. What I think is much more interesting to learn about is Wallace Fard Muhammad as an individual himself. Wallace Fard is somebody where they don't know exactly where he was born. It's possible that he was born in New Zealand, possibly Oregon, possibly Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, or Turkey. And when I was first learning about this stuff, I was like, what a crazy story. I mean, like, what is going on? Why is this stuff all fragmented? Why are there so many different possibilities? Then I began to think a little bit more, and I was like, we're dealing with the early 1900s. It's like things were not very well documented back then. We didn't have the internet, we didn't have televisions in every home. Probably most homes in rural parts of America didn't have a functioning telephone to a certain point. I mean, I'm only kind of theorizing about that, but it's like just information wasn't handled very well, and it definitely was not handled electronically, especially when you're dealing with crossing international borders. But the actual thing about Wallace Fard Muhammad is that he seemed like someone who was of a multiracial background. The story that I heard that sounded the most convincing was that his father met a Polynesian woman in New Zealand, and he was most likely conceived either in New Zealand or on the ship coming from New Zealand to America. So it's possible that he was born in either New Zealand or possibly Oregon, as we mentioned. But it's most likely that his father encountered his mother when he was in New Zealand. Once again, his mother was of Polynesian descent, and his father was a British sailor. Now, we mentioned how the Nation of Islam is kind of like a black supremacy group. It wasn't until I was actually just watching this YouTube series called The Third Degree, talking about Wallace Fard Muhammad, when they made a very bold claim that Wallace Fard was white. And he's starting this type of black centered religious movement, this Afrocentrism empowerment movement. But they're like, Wallace Fard was a white man. And I was like, wait a second. I've seen so many photos of Wallace Fard. Um, and I had heard that story that his father was a British sailor and his mother was Polynesian. I had always assumed that his father was black and his mother was Polynesian, so he's just biracial. But because I mean, a person can be British and black at the same time, obviously, right? So I looked more closely at the photos, and yeah, I guess he does have some Caucasian features, but that's the whole thing. I didn't think twice about it, and a lot of people probably didn't either. I mean, it's one of those things, though, when someone is of a multiracial background, you just can't determine the you just can't always determine their exact ethnic makeup. I mean, like, even if you look at somebody like Lester Holt, who does the news on NBC, I made a comment once about how he was black, and someone told me, no, he's not black. He's a white man with a tan. And I was like, huh. No, it just turns out he's a multiracial guy, and we saw this very clearly with the case of Lyle Stevick, when everybody was looking at Lyle Stevick's photos, kind of the death of an unknown man in the Pacific Northwest. And Lyle Stevick has since been identified, but it's like everyone was just looking at his photos and everybody saw something different. And I was showing his photo to a lot of people, and they were saying they thought he was half black, half white. They thought he was Hispanic. They thought he was Russian or Serbian or something like that. The point is, when people are of multiracial backgrounds, you can't immediately tell their ethnic ancestry. And that's kind of what we had with Wallace Fard Muhammad. He had someone who had somewhat of a different appearance, and he probably was very well aware of that his whole life, and it actually influenced some of the decisions that he made. Wallace Fard kind of took the job as a garment salesman, like trying to sell clothes, garments. I mean, he's selling clothing of various sorts in Michigan because it's part of the kind of is this like one of those migration times when a lot of people move toward Detroit because of the auto boom, because of the booming auto industry? So Wallace Fard's there, he's selling garments, and then he needed his business to pick up. So what he did was he would go to kind of some of the African American populations, and then he would advertise his clothes as, these are the garments of your ancestors. I come from a land called Mecca, talking in a silly voice and like pretending that he was born in Saudi Arabia. So it's like that's kind of he just sort of recognized that he had the ability to persuade people to get in touch with their true heritage, being that of Islam, being that of the Arabic traditions, and just most likely being against anything of the Anglophone tradition. Notice that people now, because of the Nation of Islam, they changed their kind of names to something that is of more of Arabic origin, such as Wallace Fard Muhammad, Elijah Muhammad. And then you also see other individuals like adopting more African names, like Malik Zulu Shabazz in the later 20th century, and his, of course, birth name was Paris Lewis. And the most famous example would be Muhammad Ali, who was, of course, born Cassius Clay. But you didn't always adopt an Arabic name. For example, Malcolm X adopted, just the name X because he didn't want to take the name of a slave owner, a name that is associated with the history of slavery, something of that nature. And I always remember reading about this as a kid in like the fourth grade or something. Malcolm X's wife was named Betty X, and I was like, wow, isn't that convenient? They both had the same last name. I was I was so like airheaded and naive. I didn't realize that Betty X changed her name because she met Malcolm, and you get the idea. I just thought she grew up Betty X and he grew up Malcolm X, and I was like, huh, yeah, okay, I was a little naive then. But back to Wallace Fard Muhammad. He is someone who is a very mysterious individual because he had the sort of unusual appearance, he had the kind of multiracial background that people couldn't identify. And once he began telling people that, he found out he could sell this type of material, that he could sell these things that made people feel empowered, and also they would give him money because one of the things that the Nation of Islam started to do was they would charge money for the leaders, Elijah Muhammad and Wallace Fard Muhammad, to sell them their true name of black origin, something that's kind of African and something that's kind of Arabic, just sort of a non-Western name. They would be trying to sell people names. There's a rumor that Elijah Muhammad, who was going by the name Elijah Poole at the time, Elijah Poole and Wallace Fard concocted this thing in prison as a confidence scheme, but that's totally hearsay. What I would say about Wallace Fard Muhammad is that there's also a very large conspiracy theory associated with him that he was actually Turkish, that he was working as a spy for Nazi Germany because we're dealing with the 1930s at the time. I believe the last confirmed sighting of Wallace Fard, the last definitive confirmed sighting, was in 1934. So you're just about to see the rise of Nazi Germany. I mean, the only problem with this theory is it's none other than Malik Zulu Shabazz, the guy that we mentioned earlier on, who was saying very clearly that the United States and Nazi Germany weren't at war in 1934 together. And the United States actually had a relationship with Nazi Germany for 6 years. Very famously, they competed at the 1936 Olympics. Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals. You know that story. But it's like in 1933-34, the United States and Nazi Germany weren't at war, and people of Fard's own movement are promoting that. So it's like, I mean, is it possible that Wallace Fard Muhammad was a Turkish spy? And that's why, once again, that's why people can't identify his appearance correctly. That's why people can't identify the place of his birth, what happened to him after 1934. Absolutely. Absolutely, things like that are possible. I mean, this would be one of the few times when I would say that it's only possible because of how little we know about Wallace Fard with definitive certainty. Not to mention that it kind of answers all the questions. So I'm not going to completely reject that theory. It might sound like a far out conspiracy theory to some, but I would say that that one has a certain degree of plausibility. Either that or you would just like to believe that Wallace Fard was someone who was conceived on a ship going from New Zealand to Oregon. His father was a British sailor, his mother was a Polynesian woman who got acquainted with his father. He was born in Oregon and then he stayed in America for his entire life. You could believe that too, but once again, this is one of the kind of more bizarre cases because we have someone who just has such little documentation in their life. And if Wallace Fard hadn't been instrumental in founding the Nation of Islam, then we wouldn't really be talking about him at all. He would just be kind of someone who had an interesting backstory and then just disappeared. But I would say, though, in 1934, it must be somewhat easy to disappear off the map, especially if you're just going to leave Detroit and head out to the west or something. Imagine how untamed certain parts of the country would be, like Wyoming, Montana, even Nevada to a certain extent, in the mid 1900s. Talking about 1930s, actually, so it's the kind of early 1900s to an extent. I think I was truly pulled into this case at first just because I think some of the kind of mesmerizing elements are more about people are over glorifying the mysterious nature around Wallace Fard. They're really trying to make it seem like more than what it actually is. Where you had a guy who was of a multiracial appearance, people couldn't really determine where he was from, and then he learned how to kind of manipulate this sort of black power energy. This is a predecessor to the black power movement, way before that stuff that you see in the 1960s in the movies Black Klansman, which came a little bit later on. That was, of course, depicted in the 1970s, I believe. But this is the stuff that's coming before that. So, Wallace Fard Muhammad and Elijah Muhammad kind of learned how to control this particular. I mean, not exactly control. They learned how to kind of get people fired up, for lack of a better term, based on these things about black empowerment. And there are three big things that Afrocentrism pushes as an academic movement. That first, the ancient Egyptians were black. Second, that civilization started in Africa. And the third thing is that there has been a conspiracy to hide this completely. And this all ties into a Nation of Islam story that there was this mad scientist named Yaqub, spelled Yakob, sometimes Yakub, pronounced Yaqub, and he was a black mad scientist who messed up, and one of his fatal errors created the white people, or the white man, and that launched a 6,000 year curse on the world, so that white people are essentially a curse. And this is why a lot of people don't like Louis Farrakhan because he's inspired by all this. But the thing is, that curse apparently ended in 1914 with, the start of World War One, and World War One really did change modern culture to a certain extent, but that's a conversation for another time. And then through the years following after 1914, you see the rise of people like Wallace Fard, and then he's like, okay, well, I'm God incarnate on earth, and then Elijah Muhammad is going to be the Messiah and the messenger, and they're going to share this with the world. And a lot of people could fall in line in terms of following the sequence, following the pattern. So they had a narrative that they were able to push. And so many people do this. So many people do it. It doesn't matter conspiracy theory, true crime, politics, quasi religious cult. It doesn't matter. People push narratives. And a lot of people who are in their target audience are like, okay, I can follow that narrative in a logical sequence. I can follow that from A to B to C to C. They can follow what they're saying, or that this is my idea and these are the points that support it. People can go along with stuff. Jesse Walker talks about this in the book The United States of Paranoia, a conspiracy theory. And it's talking about how, regardless of someone's education level, intelligence, humans are pattern seeking creatures. So we try to understand the world in terms of patterns. And you get the idea. People are sort of they follow things. You try and follow what somebody's saying, and you do this in a conversation or when listening to a podcast. You kind of follow some of the things. You try to follow and understand what the other person is talking about. There's even a saying that to truly debate someone, the first thing you have to do is you have to be able to comprehend the message that they're putting out. Otherwise, you can't respond appropriately. So people followed along with this message of black empowerment, black supremacy. And it starts with black empowerment because, once again, we're seeing a massive rise in, well, the improvement of the lives of African Americans going up to the civil rights era. The beginnings of the Nation of Islam are really an intermediary between World War One and the rise of the civil rights era of the 1960s. So we're having lots of cultural changes along the way, and it's no surprise that we saw something like the rise of Wallace Fard Muhammad and Elijah Muhammad, that these guys were able to kind of rile up this kind of energy in a large concentration of African Americans in Detroit. I mean, starting in Detroit, carrying on to Chicago and various other places, various other urban centers. What really happened, though, with Wallace Fard Muhammad? Was he really a Turkish spy? I mean, I think it's going to be something that's lost to history. I don't think we'll ever get a definitive answer about that. I think it would provide a certain amount of explanations, and there's a big thing to say about that. If you think that it's absolutely crazy that you could hear something that somebody like Wallace Fard Muhammad was a Turkish spy who was working in conjunction with Nazi Germany, governments try and do things like that. And that's one of the things that I have kind of learned over the past year and a half. Governments do try and start intellectual movements. They do try to change the way people think, and they put things out there. There's an excellent presentation on this called the it's about the CIA in Africa, about how the American CIA was endorsing, certain politicians and promoting certain political writers and thinkers in Africa to get a desired result from the population. I mean, they are promoting certain types of work to kind of make people think in a different way. And even, like when you sort of look at some things, like the television show Eight is Enough, based on the book by Tom Braden, is a CIA plant. Like that, Tom Braden was a CIA operative. And he even also appeared on the television show Crossfire in the 1980s. Very entertaining interviews. And that doesn't seem like anything that is truly some sort of far out wacky conspiracy. No, that just means that governments try and put out things called propaganda, things called persuasion pieces. They put out things there to sway popular culture to get a desired result. It's one of the ways that they control populations. So when I hear something like Wallace Fard Muhammad, the founder of the Nation of Islam, was working for Nazi Germany to try and fragment the American homeland, I don't think that's so crazy. I mean, it definitely created some sort of division in between the African Americans in particular urban centers and the rest of the Americans. I mean, because listen to what we said about Afrocentrism. Things such as the ancient Egyptians were black, civilization began in Africa, and there's a conspiracy to hide this. Well, that means everybody's against you. You're aggrieved. Black people need to band together to become stronger and more powerful, and they need to overthrow the work of this mad scientist who created white people. Us against them mentality, and that's very powerful. It's also like when you have someone that you can blame for all your problems, the populist scapegoat or something like that, then that really gets people riled up. And that really gets people angry at a particular social group. And that's not only the Nation of Islam, that's not only this black empowerment Afrocentrist thinking. That happens all the time. You probably can think of a few examples where that would have happened in the 21st century. I mean, we're dealing with more than 100 years since the end of World War One now. So it's like very, very kind of similar methods that have been used for centuries. I mean, I do mean it, centuries. I mean, people are divisive and they try and convene and congregate together in these tribal mentalities like our side is right and we are right because the other side is wrong. Humans do this all the time, and the stuff that Wallace Fard Muhammad was promoting is almost exactly in line with that. It's a very human thing to do. It's not necessarily a moral or ethical thing to do. It's kind of one of these tribal traits that we need to get rid of. And what we need to do is just recognize the unity of humanity and that all humans have a certain value in their life, for lack of a better term. But some of the things associated with the disappearance of Wallace Fard Muhammad is that it's very possible that he probably just didn't really want the rise to power that he was receiving. And also, people might have questioned his sort of multiracial background as the leader of a sort of black empowerment movement. I mean, a lot of people might have questioned what he was promoting and espousing. That's one of the things I've thought about before about why he disappeared and why he just kind of disappeared off the face of the earth, rather. But what I would say that is also significant of is that I mean, I think it would be rather easy for somebody of his particular ethnic background, even if he is half Caucasian, half Polynesian, or just multiracial in general. Because when you look at the photos of Wallace Fard Muhammad, I mean, he looks very multiracial. Someone of that background, he could very easily pass himself off as someone from Saudi Arabia or something. It's like, once again, he's talking in a different type of voice. He's saying he's from Afghanistan, the Middle East. That's what he's telling to people when he's trying to sell them garments and reveal their true, the name that is not given to them from the slave masters, for lack of better term, and also using the kind of terminology that Wallace Fard Muhammad would have used. So then we really need to entertain with all that is just that I think it's very possible that Wallace Fard Muhammad did not want to be the leader of this, massive, this rather large religious movement, the Nation of Islam. Maybe Elijah Muhammad did. Maybe Louis Farrakhan did. And maybe Khalid Muhammad did as well. And Khalid Muhammad was one of the people who became involved in the later 20th century. I believe he passed away in 2001, but he died of a brain tumor. But if you ever get a chance, I highly recommend watching Khalid Muhammad's appearance on Phil Donahue. In the past, I talked about that one of the better episodes of Donahue featured Milton Friedman, but really the absolute best thing Phil Donahue ever did was the interview with Khalid Muhammad, and once again, that's on just Phil Donahue's program. It was available on YouTube the last time I checked. I mean, it just really gives you some insight into the changes that we saw from 1930 with the kind of thinking of Wallace Fard Muhammad and the rise of the Nation of Islam, all the way up to the 20th century, the end of the 20th century, 1988, 1999, all of these things. There's actually a big thing that I would just like to say to kind of conclude. When I was reading that chart about what the people and the practitioners of the Nation of Islam believe about how the universe was created by Wallace Fard Muhammad, Elijah Muhammad is the prophet, there's something in there that I have never seen anywhere else, and it was that people in the Nation of Islam do not eat flour cake meals because that's like the food of slaves. And I was just like, you mean no waffles? For fuck's sake. I mean, I understand that some people don't eat pork, some people don't eat beef, Hindus don't eat beef and such. But if you're giving up pancakes and waffles, fuck that, for lack of a better term. Well, no, I've never really read that anywhere else. I don't know if that's widely a common practice, but there actually are tenets to the Nation of Islam, and it's not just something that is just blatantly thrown out that black people are better and they need to stick together. Yaqub was a mad scientist that created white people and put this curse on the world. But because what the things that we talked about, the three tenets that we mentioned, that was for Afrocentrism. The ancient Egyptians were black. Civilization began in Africa, and there's a conspiracy to hide it ever since. That's really the kind of foundation of academic Afrocentrism. And there are many tenets to the Nation of Islam that are quite different and more expansive. And it's really just more about Wallace Fard Muhammad was the reincarnation of Allah, and he's sharing the message. Elijah Muhammad was then the messenger to carry that throughout the world. And like I said, I've never found that in any other place, and they took it off of Wikipedia that the practitioners don't eat meals that were made with flour cakes. Like, I hope they don't mean no pancakes and waffles and such, but let's hope not. But the things that we need to say about Wallace Fard as well is that some of his supporters on YouTube, and you can, like, if you do just a YouTube search on Wallace Fard Muhammad, you'll see many things. And I'm glad people are having conversations and discussions about him. But the things that I noticed for them is that they're saying that the photos that you see of Wallace Fard Muhammad are not always genuine. I'm not really sure. I think they look quite different. They are many different kind of images, and one guy's even holding up like two photos of two different black celebrities. One's an actor and one's a professional basketball player. And he's like, these two guys look similar, but they're not the same person. And Gasser of Mattoon. And I mentioned that when cases are that old, a lot of the details do not get represented correctly to the general public because, well, it's like people sort of modify the descriptions, or people who are writing stuff down get it wrong. And people like who are running podcasts now, like me, sometimes I do make mistakes, and I'm always open to correction because over time people make, mistakes and errors about things, and it slowly just modifies the story. So it's possible that some of the photos out there of Wallace Fard Muhammad are not genuinely him. It's possible some of the details about his life are not genuinely him, and maybe even the tenets of what the Nation of Islam truly stood for. Well, anyway, that's all for me now. I would like to say thank you to everyone who has listened this far in the podcast. If you like this thing, you can hit the like button and subscribe. And if you really just want to talk more about this, I would love to hear from you. And if you have anything to say at all, drop a comment below. And until